Well, I guess it's 9:42, so it really is time. Um, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Today is January 17th, 2021. This is the Faith of Function class. Hi, everybody. You're being recorded. This will show up on YouTube on the Idlewild channel in a few days. Maybe they edit out all the stuff at the beginning where I just sit here. I don't actually know. I haven't gone back and looked. But anyway, our teacher today is Dr. Mitzi Minor. She is the Mary Magdalene Professor of New Testament at Memphis Theological Seminary and a longtime friend of the class. See, we practiced all this in the 10 minutes before class started. Talking more about, from the Gospel of Mark. Thank you, Dr. Minor, for being here.
Sure.
Before we hand it over to you, are there any announcements or questions? I probably can't answer questions or concerns besides Julie's water heater.
Bless her.
It was an immediate concern, but is probably getting taken care of. All right, well, I've got you here. Next week, we start 2 weeks with Pete Gatke on spirituality in a time of pandemic. So in case I forget to announce that at the end of class, we can do that. We got that now. Let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, we thank you for the chance to come here, even though here is a different place for each one of us, but to still study your word as a group. We thank you for our teacher today and for all those who work to do your work in the world, and both to teach others and to work in other ways. For all these things, we thank you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, good morning again, everyone. Some of us have been chit-chatting a little bit already, but I'm really glad. We were talking about things about Zoom that we may continue once we no longer have to. One of the things we're going to have to come up with, I think, is a new phrase. So I started to say, I'm really glad to be here, except where I am is my dining room. So I guess what I need to say is I'm glad to be with you all again. And I wish and look forward to when we can do this again face to face. At the same time, given the realities of the world, I'm delighted for Zoom because we can at least gather and share with one another, even if it's over the internet this way. So I'm grateful for all those things this morning, even in difficult times. I know that all of you I'm pretty sure I know that all of you are concerned, as I am concerned, about the week ahead and potential for violence and disturbing kinds of activities. And what we're going to see today, looking at Jesus' spirituality in Mark, is actually going to address some of these things. So we'll keep those in mind as we go through. So for these 2 weeks that I've been with you, that's been the topic, the spirituality of Jesus as Mark presents it. And I'm defining spirituality for us as the sense or experience. Experience might make us think something happened. And that's not, that's not necessarily the case. That's why I keep throwing in the word sense, S-E-N-S-E, sense. So the sense or experience of God, and then how one lives in response to that sense or experience. And last week, we took a look at Jesus' experience of God as Mark sort of lets that unfold for us. And what we were able to see, so I'm going to do a quick recap here. And let me remind you again that my notes are over here. So if you see me looking this way, that's what I'm doing, okay? So we had a chance to see last week that while Jesus in Mark speaks of God directly, pretty rarely in Mark, we have a chance to discern from the way Mark tells the story that Jesus was significantly shaped and formed in his spirituality by the traditions, his Jewish traditions, that paint a picture of the God of the Exodus. The God is presented by Isaiah. The God is presented by Daniel, and we could say Daniel and other apocalyptic writers. So Mark begins his story with Isaiah's words, prepare the way of the Lord. And then he presents for us that Jesus' very first words, well, not his literal first words, but the first words Mark records in the gospel, is the kingdom of God has drawn near. And in that first century context, what that would have said to Jesus' hearers and also to Mark's readers is that the God who had long promised through Isaiah and through Daniel that God would act in creation so as to renew all of creation, that evil does not get the last word in God's creation, and that God is now fulfilling those promises. The kingdom of God, that phrase, is Jesus' favorite way of describing the renewal that God has now launched. So we see Exodus and Daniel impacting Jesus there. And then as we watch Jesus live this out, what we see is him living out the God of the Exodus, who heard the cries of the slaves down in Egypt. We'll have a chance to come back to that idea in just a bit. But that God, as well as the God of Isaiah, who talked about God gathering all nations and all people together, that all of us, in terms of these parts of the Jewish tradition, are beloved children of God. And the renewal that God is launching through Jesus is the gathering in of all those people. In addition, is the focus on liberation. Now, obviously, the God of the Exodus liberates the slaves down in Egypt and leads them to the promised land. And we find other ways. Isaiah is a wonderful study. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I couldn't do Isaiah easily as a full study. But the emphasis there on setting people free to live the lives that God has called them to live, such a big part of that story. So gathering God's people and then liberating them to live into the justice and righteousness and peace that God always intended to be a part of our lives in God's good creation. And so that's the stories that shape Jesus' spirituality and which he then sets out to live. I noted last week, right at the end of class, that in the same way that Jesus doesn't talk directly about God very much, he also doesn't address directly very often the things that we normally associate with spirituality, like prayer or worship or Sabbath observance, those kinds of things. Instead, what we find is Jesus teaching and living into. And those two things together seem to me to be very important, because Jesus is presented as both proclaimer and teacher of the arrival of God's kingdom, but that's not all he does. He then lives as if that is true. He lives indeed into God's kingdom, making it a reality for himself and for those around him, those who listen to him and join him. I mentioned last week that of all of the charges that are leveled against Jesus by his enemies, hypocrite is not one of them. He said it, and then he lived as if that were true. And so that was what we examined last week in terms of Jesus' sense or experience of God and his announcement of God's kingdom. And what I told you last week and what we're going to do today now is see how he did that. How did he live into God's kingdom? How did he not just teach it, but demonstrate it and make it a reality for those who were listening and following him? So I'm really glad you asked that question. Okay. So what we find, again, if the background is that all nations and all people are welcome into God's kingdom and are liberated to share God's peace, then we should expect, if Jesus isn't a hypocrite, we should expect to see him in Mark living that out. And boy, do we ever. For those of you who like to read along with, I'm going to start at the very beginning of Mark today in chapter 1. Excuse me. In chapter 1, and take a look at a couple of the stories with which Mark begins his gospel. Okay, so chapter 1, verse 16, this is right after Mark has sort of introduced us to Jesus and had him declare that the kingdom of God has drawn near. And then with that, the first thing that Mark records Jesus doing is this. So chapter 1, verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. First of all, do you ever want to chuckle at that? They were casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Well, why else would they be casting a net into the sea? Sometimes I just, I love to chuckle at the things that are there. So they are fishermen, and Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And then Jesus does something very similar with James and John, who were also fishermen in the immediate aftermath of calling Simon Peter and Andrew. Okay, so file that away and then look down with me in verse 29, still in chapter 1. So as soon as they, meaning Jesus and his followers, left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. And now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. The fever left her, and she began to serve them, which is what my translation reads and what any translation that you have likely reads, and which makes me frankly want to kick something. Because it makes it sound like she was sick, Jesus healed her, and she got up and fixed dinner for them, which is so crummy that I can't even stand it. And it's such a gender biased way of translating, even in our 21st century. What it should, the word that is translated serve is the verb that became the verb for doing ministry as a follower of Jesus. So it should be translated, she got up and did ministry with them. In other words, she joined the movement and became a part of what they were doing in the world. She did not fix dinner. Drives me crazy. From there, go to verse 40. So if you're following on, still in chapter 1. A leper came to Jesus, begging him and kneeling. He said, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose. Be made clean." Lepers, for a whole host of reasons, were among the most, maybe the most unclean people from the perspective of first century Jewish world. I'll come back and talk about that issue of being clean and unclean in a little bit. But they were literally outcasts. And Jesus not only heals him, you notice he reached out and touched him, which we know from other stories Jesus doesn't need to do. So it's almost Jesus defiantly showing that the way they had cast out this man was wrong, and welcomes him in. And then one last text for this moment, down in chapter 2, verse 15. That in Jesus sat at dinner in Levi's house, and many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" So, here we are at 2:15. We're, in other words, not very far into the gospel. And Mark has recorded Jesus reaching out to and including people who were not included in that world. Fishermen were actually practitioners of a despised occupation because they couldn't keep the purity rituals that separated Jews from Gentiles and declared them as set apart for God. Because of their work out on the water and out there, it's a little hard if you're out on a boat in the water to stop and go, "Oh, it's time to, do one of our rituals, at the moment." And so they weren't able to do that. I've already mentioned that lepers were among the most unclean from that perspective. And again, cleanliness was not about, germs or viruses. It was about, again, being ritually set apart for God. The rituals were symbols that indicated that they were set apart for God in ways that other people were not. And those who didn't do them or couldn't do them or didn't meet the requirements then were called unclean. And it didn't mean they didn't take a bath, although, first century people don't take them like we do. But it was about, again, their being set apart for God. Tax collectors and sinners were also unclean and cast out. Sinner in that world, by the way, didn't mean always, the way it does in our world, a moral failure. It could, but more significantly, what it indicated was someone who had done something that made them unworthy from the perspective of others, unworthy of the people of God. So it could be a moral failure, but it also could be something like failure to pay your temple tax. Maybe you couldn't afford it, or keeping those purity rituals I already mentioned, or being a practitioner of a despised occupation. All those things in that world made you a sinner. Didn't mean you were a bad person, but it meant from their perspective that you were not worthy of the people of God. And then there's Simon's mother-in-law. And women in that world were not considered in the same category. Well, officially, let me put it this way, officially, women were not considered to be in the same category as tax collectors or lepers. But in reality, that's how they were treated. Women were, from their perspective, the only reason for women to exist was so that they could have sons. And that was pretty necessary. But other than that, women didn't count. They weren't really full participants in the life of the people of God. So when I put all that out there for you, look at who Jesus is including intentionally and right off the bat. All of these folks who would have been considered outcast and unworthy of the people of God. And he goes and draws them in. So in chapter 3, verses 34 and 35, we have a very intriguing moment where Jesus' family is actually concerned about him, and they may well be concerned about his safety. But they come and try to get to Jesus. And at verse 34, in response, after Jesus is told they're looking for him, in verse 34, chapter 3, he says, actually, let's start in verse 33. He said, Jesus replied to those who said his family was looking for him. He said, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." Whoever does the will of God. So a new definition of family in a world where families were significant for one's identity. Whoever does the will of God is my mother and sister and brother. And so in these ways, and again, countless other stories. I mentioned last week that Jesus breaks bread on both the Jewish and Gentile sides of the Sea of Galilee in the wilderness, the way Moses had shared manna in the wilderness with the children of Israel. He does that on both the Jewish and Gentile sides of the sea. He welcomes Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, and a Syrophoenician woman. I mean, the list is just endless of those who'd been told they were outcast and unworthy. And Jesus welcomes them into the community of the people of God that he is forming. Many of you know already, many of you have heard me say, but you probably have read it and knew it already, that the most common charge leveled against Jesus by his opponents was, he eats with tax collectors and sinners. In that world, you didn't. In that world, you ate with people like yourself. And we're going to talk about that just in a second. But unless your name was Jesus of Nazareth. And I always get tickled. I always think when they said to him, "You eat with tax collectors and sinners," his response would have been, "Yes, and?" As opposed to arguing or defending. He would have been, "Yeah, I do." And your point would be what? And I don't know about you, but I would love to see them go, but, and however they wanted to respond. So this is so significant to the story of Jesus that Mark tells us. If the kingdom of God has drawn near, if the renewal of all creation is breaking out, then all peoples and all nations should be welcomed in. And we see Jesus doing exactly that intentionally and in many ways defiantly in terms of their rules. Let me talk about that for just a moment. Roman rule in the first century was hierarchical, only a few at the top, and everybody else sort of trying to define a place underneath them and hoping that they'll have an opportunity to climb. It wasn't just first century Roman rule either, was it? We still talk about climbing the ladder, in our time. And so Roman rule was hierarchical and it was patriarchal. Only men are at the very top of the thing. Last semester, when I was teaching at MTS, I moaned a lot that one of the things you don't have when you teach in this format is I don't have my whiteboard, behind me to get up and illustrate something if I need to with all my intense artistic abilities. And yes, you should hear me kind of making fun of myself because I don't have it as I say that. But they'll tell you at the seminary that they can always tell if I've been in a classroom because there's usually a pyramid drawn up on the whiteboard as a way of illustrating that only a few were at the top. And they were men. And everybody else kind of found a place and then hoped that from that place they'd be able to climb up more toward the top. Roman propaganda then proclaimed that the gods had chosen the Roman rulers to be at the top of that pyramid, that they were the most worthy, they were the most blessed, they were the most trusted, they were the most. And that's how they got those positions of power and of favor and of privilege in Roman order. I mean, they would say, how else would we have gotten here if the gods had not chosen us? And see, that's their story. And in many ways, the story of the God of the Exodus is the counter to that. Because the God of the Exodus heard the cries of the slaves down in Egypt. The God of Isaiah said all peoples and all nations will be welcomed among the people of God. So the implications then of Jesus living out his experience of the God of the Exodus and the God of Isaiah is that inclusion of all people and all nations will break down Roman hierarchy as well as Roman patriarchy. That should happen if Jesus is actually doing this. And what we see in Mark is that we do see Jesus, doing this. So over in chapter 9, verse 33, if I got that right, yeah, chapter 9, verse 33, as Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem to confront the powers, there is a moment that sounds like this. So they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked his disciples, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. The deal with hierarchies is it's an interlocking connection of other hierarchies. If this is how the world is organized, and you've got a very few at the top, well, then you've got these other smaller pyramids in the midst of that as people find their place, and then they jockey for position even in their place. And so we find Jesus' disciples doing exactly that. They're arguing with one another who was the greatest. Don't you know that some days Jesus wanted to walk over and say to God, did I make a mistake here? Did I pick up the do not call list in my accident? With the way, sometimes these followers of Jesus must have driven him nuts. And this may have been one of those times. Here's what he does in response. He sat down and he called the 12 and he said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Now just recognize that's not a flip-flop. I'm going to put the people on bottom on top. If everybody is choosing to serve everybody else, hierarchy goes away. People have different responsibilities and functions, and they will have different calls from God, as we know, but none is better or worse or higher or lower. Everybody chooses to serve everybody else. And then to make his point, he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." And one of the things for you to know is the first century world was an adult-oriented culture. Children did not count until they became productive adults. And by the way, that doesn't mean their parents didn't love them. I'm talking culturally speaking now. And probably the reason for that is because most peasant children in this world, I say most, more than 50% of children at peasant level in this world did not live past their 16th birthday. Issues of food and healthcare and Roman violence, all of that combined. And so they weren't counted. They didn't count until they became productive adults. So what that means in terms of the hierarchy of the first century world is, I said everybody looked for a place on the pyramid. Children didn't have one. They weren't even on the hierarchy until they became productive adults. And what that means then is that there is no gain, there's no glory, there's no positive impact for anyone in that world then to attend to or care for children. Again, that's culturally speaking. It doesn't mean parents don't care about their children. In fact, we have lots of stories where they did. But culturally speaking, that was the case. And so when Jesus gathers this child and takes it in his arms and says to them, "Whoever welcomes a child welcomes me." Remember what a child was. "And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me." So where do you find God? Not at the top of that power structure, but among, frankly, everyone, including those that the culture determines are the least of these. There is no hierarchy for Jesus. People are often interested, and in fact, we're going to see the disciples are very interested in it. You got to, when hierarchy exists, what we want to do is we want to be the ones at the top. You can actually hear the disciples sometimes hear, "Who's the greatest?" Jesus put us in charge and we'll do it right. But hierarchy is, by definition, unjust, because there are some at the bottom and those at the top are intent on protecting their place. Because if this is the way the world is organized, if the world is a hierarchy, then your goal should be to get to the top. And what Jesus says is, we're not going to worry about getting to the top. We're undoing hierarchy all the way, period. None. That's not what we're doing here. One of my favorite illustrations of this is in chapter 11. It's actually kind of funny. So in chapter 11, verse 27, Jesus is in Jerusalem now, confronting the powers. And the day before, as this story unfolds, Jesus had done what we call the cleansing of the temple. So he had, thrown out the money changers and those who were selling things and those who were collecting taxes in the temple, because that happened as well. And that is the seat of the powers in Israel. The chief priests are not only the chief religious functionaries in that world, but they're also the allies of Rome. They run the economy, which you can't separate in that world. So they are the powers, and they're Roman allies. That's how they got to be power in Israel. And they operate out of the temple. So when Jesus had come in and in a prophetic sign act had knocked over tables and driven people out, it was a way for him to say, God is not happy with you. Now, 20 minutes after he did this, they'd probably set their tables back up and were continuing with what they planned to do. It's not that he stopped the activity, it's that he made a point. And his point was, you are not doing the work of God in the world, despite your robes and your pointy hats or whatever it was they wore around. Okay. And so it's a direct challenge to what they're about. And what they're about significantly, again, is that hierarchy. And in Israel, in Israel's pyramid, they were at the top of it. And Jesus had challenged that. So the day after, in verse 27, says, again, Jesus and his disciples came to Jerusalem. They stayed at night in Bethany, just outside Jerusalem. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them? You know, Mark doesn't tell us, but I don't know about you, but the way I imagine this story is they came in their full regalia. They had on their robes and their pointy hats and all the symbols of their office, and probably had some Roman soldiers as their bodyguards just to make a point. And they walked up to Jesus, and essentially their question is, who do you think you are? And of course, their point is, this is who we are. We are at the top here, not you. You would be a Galilean from nowhere. You know, you are from the outback of nowhere. Who do you think you are? And all of this effort on their part to reinforce their hierarchy. And so what Jesus is supposed to do at this point is be intimidated, right? And he's supposed to, I mean, this is dangerous. And in fact, in a few days, they're going to kill him. So this is dangerous. And by coming in with this, and who do you think you are? And trying to stifle him, what he is supposed to do is, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I'm not saying anything about your ruler or how you're conducting things. I was just talking about the temple should be a place where we do more praying, or something. That's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to, sort of reposition himself as somebody down in the hierarchy, and these folks are at the top, and he's supposed to sort of cower. That's how this world works. Look what he does instead. So Jesus said to them, I'll ask you one question. Answer me, and then I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. This makes me laugh. Literally, he's supposed to cower. Here they are. And again, don't you know that they are doing all they can to show off, this is who we are, and this is who you are. And if you've ever seen a scene like this unfold, what almost happens, almost involuntarily, is you start making yourself smaller, because that's the intent. One of my faculty colleagues talked one time about noticing his body language when he had gotten called in on the carpet about something, much earlier in, his life. And he was getting called in. He got called in, and he was getting ripped apart for what he had done, which was challenge the authority of this particular person. And they, when he got there, they made him sit down, and they stood up, all of the intimidating things. And he said he could feel himself doing this, and maybe you've been there, and I have. And he had to make a concerted effort to sit back up and get his shoulders up and not look at the floor, in shame like that. And see, that's what they wanted Jesus to do. So he would do this. Let me tell you something. I got a question for you. They're like, this is not how this is supposed to go. And then his question is, was John the Baptist, was he from God, or was he just doing the work of a human being? I just love this. And if you can imagine the scene, there's people standing around, because the temple is, this is Passover. And so there are lots of people in temple. And they're watching this, and they see these guys walk up and ask Jesus this, and then they hear his response. And they're like people at a tennis match, like, okay, they said this, and then he said this. Now, what you going to say? And what they say is, we don't know. Because they couldn't, if they said he was from God, then Jesus was going to say, well, why didn't you listen? And if they said, well, he was just a man doing a human kind of a thing, then the people were going to be mad at them because they thought he was a prophet. And so Jesus has put them between a rock and a hard place. And their response, now we got to remember, their response to the Galilean outback nobody person, their response to him is, we don't know. And then Jesus said, then I'm not answering your question. And he walks away. The story illustrates how Jesus simply didn't live with a hierarchy. It's not that he wanted to change positions or he wanted it to work better. He's just not doing it, period. That's not how I'm living. And so he didn't play by any of the rules of hierarchy. Earlier in Mark, he had explicitly told us that's what he would do. If you want to flip back one chapter into chapter 10, verse 35. And once again, this story begins with an unflattering moment with the disciples. Okay, so chapter 10, verse 35, they're almost in Jerusalem. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come forward to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said, what do you want me to do for you? Because Jesus was nobody's fool. And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Give us the seats of honor and power when you come in power. When you are sitting at the top of the pyramid. That's what they're saying. When you're at the top of the pyramid, let us have the right and left hand, the seats of power beside you, the seats of honor beside you. So they are still operating, even though they've been with Jesus a good while, they're still operating out of this sense of hierarchy is just how it is. And so what we want is to climb to the top of it. Well, Jesus, says to them, it's not mine to give, and some other things. I want us to pick the story up in verse 41. And it says, when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. And what's funny here is the Greek word that's translated as anger also has an element of envy to it. So they weren't angry at James and John because they had made such a ridiculous request. They were angry because James and John beat them to it. And so they are angry at them. And Jesus called them and said to them, you know that among the Gentiles, and what he really means is the Romans, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. Once again, if we're all choosing to be servants of one another, then nobody's up and nobody's down. We might have different services. We will have different services. Nobody's up and nobody's down. Look at Jesus. You know how they operate. It is not so among you. And so Jesus' work then, as he lives out God's kingdom, as he welcomes in all peoples and all nations, his work also necessarily undoes the hierarchy that had been imposed on them by the Romans, and let's be honest, ever since then, before and after. It's the way those in power, in fact, organize the world. So let's talk about some implications of Jesus saying this. I can think of at least three. The first of these is that hierarchies are necessarily competitive. If only a few can get to be at the top, then people are going to compete to get there. So they're necessarily competitive, which also then means that they're going to be comparative. Where am I on the pyramid? Where are you on the pyramid? Are you above me, so I need to try to climb over you? Are you below me, so I need to keep you in your place? Why do you think the disciples were arguing about who was the greatest? That's the way hierarchies work. So they're competitive they're comparative, and that also means they are adversarial. That is necessarily so when that is how you organize your world. So ending hierarchy among us means the possibility of new relationships among us, relationships that are non-competitive, non-comparative, and non-adversarial, so that we live and relate to one another as children of God, obviously quite differently than the way the world is. And it leads us instead to a focus on compassion and generosity rather than climbing a ladder. It means you can welcome a child. It means you can eat with tax collectors and sinners. We have a new kind of relationship when a hierarchy is undone. That's a first implication. A second of that, and this one has jumped out at me most recently because of our circumstances, and that is that the ending of hierarchy and of the way in which people are divided into those little pyramids in the midst of a big pyramid also means that Jesus' way of relating to others connects people who were formerly disconnected from one another. And disconnected people are more easily able to stereotype others, to scapegoat others, to hate them, and to do violence to them. I'm going to guess this is sounding familiar to a lot of you in our own time, right? So in Jesus' world, Jews and Gentiles were disconnected from one another, but upper classes within cultures were disconnected from the other 95% of people, because the upper class, again, you only have a few at the top. And so those upper classes made up, our best guess is 3 to 5% of the population. And they lived lives very different from the other 95%. We're disconnected from them. But even among the others, for example, Jewish working class people were separated or were disconnected from those who couldn't work, like, beggars or people who were ill in other ways, lepers, for example, the paralyzed guy in chapter 2 that Jesus heals. They're disconnected from those folks, again, because hierarchy means I want to know where I am and where you are. And so they were disconnected. But even among Jewish working class people, there were disconnects. So tax collectors were working class people, but they worked for the wrong people. And so the disconnection was there. So in Jesus' world, there was lots of us and them. And them are bad. And the more tense the circumstances, the more making them into bad people intensifies. But Mark shows us that Jesus' way of living connected all of these people. They sat at table together. They were welcomed among the people of God. That's a second implication of undoing the hierarchy. And here's a third. And in many ways, this is a particular point for us to hear as Western Christians. Western Christianity has tended to focus on personal spirituality. In our world, if people are talking about spirituality, they're most often talking about prayer, Sabbath observance, worship, maybe meditation, maybe contemplation, those things that have to do with our interior relationship with God. And Mark shows us Jesus going to synagogue and in prayer and sharing in worship and calling his disciples to fast at some point. But the emphasis in Mark's story of Jesus is not there. The emphasis in Mark's story of Jesus' spirituality is that our relationships with one another must necessarily be renewed, must necessarily be different than what our culture almost always teaches us, not just in the first century world, but in ours as well. And that our relationships with, our connections to the other people in our world whom we are invited by Jesus to see as beloved children of God, that those relationships are as essential to our spirituality and to our living into a renewed creation or participating in God's renewal of creation. Our relationships with one another are absolutely essential. So our interior relationship with God absolutely matters. But the way we live that out and our interactions with, our welcoming of, our viewpoints of others around us is absolutely essential if we practice Jesus' spirituality and if we participate in God's renewal in the world. Now, another piece to what Mark tells us about Jesus' spirituality and about his inauguration of God's renewal, about the new relationships that he makes possible and that he then lives out, the connections among us and our connection with God that he lives out, to grasp that this is even possible and the impact it can have, we need to have eyes to see it. And we're not talking about our physical eyes, right? You know, maybe you've all had a moment at some point where somebody tells you something and something, we'll even say that something clicked. And we might say, oh, I see. And that's the kind of sight Jesus calls us to have. It's one of the most fun and most intriguing parts of Mark's gospel. So back in Mark chapter 4, I mentioned that there aren't long teaching sections in Mark very often, but there are some, and one of the most important is in Mark chapter 4, and it's verses 1 to 34. You're going to be glad to hear me say I'm not going to read all of that. But in this teaching time, and Jesus, by the way, all through here is teaching in parables. And parables try to get us to see something we hadn't seen before. Parables are intended for us to go, oh, wait, what did you just say? Okay? And that's what they're intended to do. And as Jesus is teaching in parables, in chapter 4, in verse 24, he says to them, my translation says, pay attention to what you hear. But the literal Greek is, see what you hear, which you can't literally do. You know, we don't see our words. We are cartoon figures that have bubbles coming out of our mouth with our words in them, right? And so he's not talking about physical sight. He's talking about being insightful or perceptive or seeing beneath the surface or beyond the moment. Whatever is your favorite way of discussing that kind of sight. Sometimes we talk about the eyes of faith. Okay? And so see what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given to you. For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And at that verse, if you ever read that and thought, Jesus, what the heck are you saying? It's really a phenomenal thing, because in the first century world, this was their lived experience. The people who had more got more. And peasants and working class folks lived on the edge of survival all the time, and it didn't take much for them to fall off and lose what little they already had. Taxes went up, or the breadwinner died, or the rains didn't come, and the crops died in the field, and they would lose what little they had. But Jesus takes that experience and turns it around now and makes it into a powerful spiritual teaching that, in the context of his call to see, tells us that if we are willing to see, if we're willing to open ourselves to what God is revealing. And friends, let me tell you this, revelation is not a given. We have to be willing to receive God's revelation. And you know, from Bible stories and likely from your own experience, that sometimes God's revelation is not exactly what you wanted to hear. Okay? When I've been in a situation and feel like I've been wronged, and God says to me, you need to go make amends, my response tends to be, well, I didn't do anything wrong. That person can come to me. And that's a small example, but I hope it makes the point that we have to be open to revelation. And if we are willing to see, if we're open to revelation, Jesus says there's going to be more and more and more of what God is doing for us to see. But if we shut that down, if we're unwilling to see, we will become unable to see. And so we are called by Jesus then to see what it is that God is doing. And this is the context in which I want us to note in chapter 9, verse 1. One of my favorite little nuggets with Jesus. You have these moments when he tosses something out, and it's easy to run right by it. And then one day maybe it catches you. And this is one of those kinds of verses. So in chapter 9, verse 1, after Jesus had been telling them what they were going to be facing when they came to Jerusalem, and the disciples did not want to hear it. They didn't want to hear that he was going to die. And so they're like, oh, no, not that. And so in the aftermath of that, he says to them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. That's not a prediction that there's going to be some cataclysmic event in their lifetime. It's some of you are going to get it, even though right then they were resistant. Some of you are going to see. You're going to see what God is doing, and you're going to recognize the significance of it. Here's what I suspect is going on here. In Jesus' day and our day, people have often been taught to value the big moments, the grand events, or even the dazzling display of power via force. Those make the big impacts, is what many of us have been taught, what our culture teaches, what first century culture taught. Remember the phrase shock and awe? You remember that one? But Jesus is insisting that new ways of relating to each other as welcomed and beloved children of God have great power for renewal. But we have to be able to see beyond what the culture has taught us about the grand or dazzling moment in order to recognize the renewing power of the relationships that Jesus is demonstrating. Recently, I was walking and listening to a podcast, which I do a lot these days, particularly in the pandemic, to just get out of my house sometimes, right? So I'm listening to a podcast that featured poet Naomi Shihab Nye, and she made this statement. I love this. She said, having any kind of large impact in the world is the result of having 1,000 small impacts along the way. Most of us won't do grand or dazzling things, but our opportunity for having 1,000 small impacts along the way abounds. And new relationships fall into that category. So this is how Jesus lived, and heading toward the end of our time, let me note this. The Romans could see the power of what Jesus was doing because they recognized the kind of threat he was. They had organized the world hierarchically. They sat at the top of that pyramid. They controlled the politics and the economics of that world. They enriched themselves. They stayed on top by exerting great force and bringing lots of violence. And here was Jesus demonstrating that there was another way to live altogether. And their subjects, Roman subjects, could see what Jesus was doing and choose to basically ignore Rome, sort of the way he did when they asked, who do you think you are? We're not interested in that. We're interested in renewing creation and different kinds of relationships and being able to share justice and therefore peace with one another. And that's an enormous threat to Roman rule. And they recognized it. And so they threatened him, and the threats intensified. And we know that in the end, they're going to kill him because of that. But the thing is, Jesus just kept on. No matter what they said, no matter how intense the threat became, he continued living out God's renewal. And as he did, here's another way he set his people free to live righteously and justly in the world. Take a look with me in chapter 10, verse 45. I read the first part of this text a moment ago, but stopped at 44. Let's pick up with verse 45. After Jesus had called them to serve one another, he says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Ransom is what you pay to set a slave free. One of the things to remember about the first century world is, we've grown up with the Easter story, with resurrection. But in the first century world, obviously they had not. And belief in resurrection among Jews was still fairly new. Most of them at this point seem to have believed or affirmed resurrection, but not all. And it was still fairly new in their tradition. Greco-Roman folks basically didn't believe in life beyond the grave, period. In that context, Rome's threat of death was huge for them. Because if you don't believe in life beyond the grave, and if you only hope it's there and are not real sure you hope it's there, but you can't help but hope it's there, but you don't know, the threat of death was enormous, and it kept people in Roman control. And so look what Jesus did. He's kept going. If you don't stop, we will kill you. And basically he did the Rosa Parks. Go ahead, because I'm not stopping. And they killed him. And they didn't stop him. So that Jesus' faith, Jesus' trust in God as the God of life, his trust to the point that he was willing to keep going no matter what Rome threatened and face death. And let's be clear, this is no flippant religious sounding words. His crucifixion was horrible. You may even remember that from the cross, he screams, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, that awful, horrible moment, he really did feel like maybe I blew it here. Maybe God isn't with me. But even to be there in that moment is such an incredible sign of his faith in the God of life. And then he was resurrected. And they experienced him as resurrected. And that also, he gave his life as a ransom to set them free from their fear of Roman death. So that after his resurrection, when they finally could see, they lived like Jesus lived. And they were, in fact, a threat to Rome, but not with weapons, with a new way of life. So we can add now to Jesus' sense of God as the God of Exodus, of Isaiah, and of Daniel, we can add the God of life and his great faith in the God of life. So with all of that, I think we're at an end, and I'm looking at the time and know I've run over. If you'll give me a few minutes, I'll make a conclusion for us. Here is Mark's presentation of Jesus' spirituality. And once again, let me point out that the interior part, prayer and worship in synagogue or Sabbath observance, all of that mattered then, it matters now. But Jesus, as Mark presents it, Mark emphasizes Jesus living out new relationships where we're able to live together, welcome all people. We don't have to be competitive or adversarial or comparative. All of us are children of God together. We can all serve one another and serve God together. And in that way, we can heal and care for one another. And Jesus did this, and he formed communities of grace and joy. even in the midst of Roman oppression. I mentioned earlier the sense of connection. Recent events in our time have shown us it's not new. I mean, people have been talking about disconnection in American culture for some time. Do you remember the book Bowling Alone from a few years ago? But recent events have really shown how deep our disconnection has become. And by the way, I'm just going to toss this out there that one of the reasons that studies have suggested that our disconnection is even deeper now has to do with the internet and social media. So I'll just throw that out there. I don't have time to explore it. But it's deep and it's real. And so here we have a story, a gospel story where Jesus lives in such a way that all people are welcome, all people are valued. Every person is a beloved child of God. Every person is a beloved child of God. And in that way, reconnecting folks and forming connections that had been lost in the way that world was ordered. What about our world? It seems to me that those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus in our time should be the ones showing the rest of the world how to make connections between folks. And we're good at saying things like, well, anyone who wants to come is welcome in our church. And I don't doubt that. But let's be honest, that's pretty passive. We wait for somebody to come and we'll welcome. What can we do in such a time as this, to live out Jesus' spirituality and to seek and practice and create new connections among people who are often disconnected from one another? So my last thought for today is this. I mentioned that Jesus does not speak about God directly very often. But one of the times that he does is to say this: nothing is impossible with God. He says it 4 times in Mark's gospel. It's not always worded that way, but the sentiment is the same. Nothing is impossible with God. We can, though we hadn't been very good at it, but we can find ways to reconnect, and we can find ways to show the world there are ways to do this. We can let Jesus' spirituality shape our spirituality. Here's hoping that we seize that opportunity. How's that, by the way, for a New Year's resolution, huh? Okay. Friends, thanks be to God. I don't know, Daniel, if there's any moment. I'll take a few questions if there's any time, but I know you all are headed to worship really quickly, so I don't want to take any more time away. I'm already over a little bit. But
the hallways are shorter in our own houses, so I don't think they've started broadcasting it yet. Are there questions?
Yeah, if anyone's got a question, I'll try to answer that as we go. And if you don't, that's fine too. Okay. All right, Daniel, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you all again for the opportunity to share with you these 2 Sundays.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. See you guys next week.
All right. Blessings, everyone.